My great-aunt had died the year before last. Her house was locked up in probate until issues of inheritance were settled. My father was acting as caretaker of the property, which meant I took care of the place while my old man bought booze with my great-aunt's money. I didn't mind. Got me out of my place, away from my old man, and it made a nice place to have parties and hang out with my friends. My friend Chris loved the place. I think he also needed a place to hide, somewhere away from his own house with all of his dead mother's things laying around, right where she left them before a sleep-deprived truck driver snuffed out her life like a candle on a store-bought birthday cake. Our big plan was to host a Halloween party, just for our small group of friends. Chris quickly latched on to the idea of having a séance, and spent a lot of his time at the library, or at some of the local used bookstores, researching. I told him it was no big deal, that it was just a stupid party trick, but he insisted on getting it right. I guess Chris was messed up about his mother's death, and I should have thought about that, about why he was so concerned with contacting the dead, but he didn't talk about her very much, and as I've said before, I was stupid. There are things that happen when you're 19 that stay with you. You don't think they will, but they do. And if that's not the definition of haunted, I don't know what is. I met Chris as he was walking back from the dollar store that evening. He was carrying several bags of Halloween candy, some chips, and a few bottles of soda. He climbed into my car, and I drove us to the house. He dumped the candy into a large plastic bowl and smacked my hand when I tried to filch some. "It's for the trick-or-treaters, jerk," he said. As the afternoon faded into evening, the trick-or-treaters did show up, giggling in their Spider-Man and Incredible Hulk masks. I doled out the candy while Chris ordered pizza and set up the food on the kitchen table. Now, Pete, Liz, and Sophia arrived by 8. I was excited that Sophia had shown up. I'd been crushing on her for months. But at 6'4", 140, and bright red curly hair, I looked like a scarecrow that tried to dress up like Ronald McDonald. Sophia was tiny, cool, beautiful, with jet black hair and skin that may have never seen sunlight. She was my secret reason for having the party. Now, I didn't stand a chance, but a guy could hope. Liz was Pete's longtime girlfriend. She was almost as tall as me, with a shaved head, several piercings, and a full sleeve of tattoos on both arms. I'm pretty smart, but Liz, she's a genius. She aced every exam without trying, and was taking college-level classes in 9th grade. We had been friends for several years, and had shared several classes at high school until she dropped out halfway through her 12th grade. The vice principal was a dick and told her in no uncertain terms that she would not allow a tattooed freak like Liz to represent the school as a valid Victorian. Liz broke the woman's jaw in 2 places, and that was pretty much it for Liz's public education. Pete was wrecked when he walked through the door. I'd been friends with Pete since we were toddlers. His mother had worked with mine at the same hospital, before my mother left town. I loved Pete like he was a brother, but he had several bad habits, self-destruction being high on the list. He nodded his hello, then staggered into the cabinet where my great-aunt kept her liquor, and liberated a bottle of peach schnapps. By 9, Pete had retired to the monstrous old red couch in the living room, cold cloth over his eyes and a bucket by his side. "Why's he overindulging?" I asked Liz as we shoved the furniture out of the way. Chris and Sophia rolled up the large area rug, exposing the hardwood floor beneath. "Failed his driver's license exam?" Liz said, rolling her eyes. "Again?" Chris said, brushing his thick brown hair out of his eyes. "This is what, his 5th time to take it? And here I thought they just gave it to you out of pity after 5 tries. At least he didn't vomit blueberry pancakes on the instructor's shoes," Like he did last time, Sophia said. The heavy old grandfather clock in the living room bonged 10 times. Chris stood up. All right, everybody, let's get started. Liz tried to get Pete to join us, but he was fast asleep, and Chris returned to the room carrying a large wooden box. He opened the box and removed a small jar of salt and several candles. He motioned for us to sit in a circle, and he poured the salt in a double ring around us. He poured another, smaller double ring a few feet away in front of the fireplace. He then carefully taped down several pieces of paper, onto which he had previously drawn strange geometric symbols. I took the candles and positioned them at points around the circles, then lit them with my Zippo. Chris motioned for us all to sit within the larger circle. He dimmed the lights and joined us. We took our positions around a small wooden toolbox. The circle was small. When Sophia sat next to me, her knee touched mine. I tried to concentrate on something other than her perfume. Chris folded open the top and removed a metal bowl, which he placed onto a metal stand. He pulled some pieces of wood from the box, put them in the bowl, and lit them. He pulled a fabric-shrouded object from the box and placed it in front of him. The dark cloth revealed a book bound in black leather, and when Chris opened the yellow pages, instead of being brittle, they turned with an odd ease. Chris flipped through the pages, and when he stopped, the sallow pages lay slackly open without a hint of curling. He began a low chant in a sing-song rhythm, and while chanting, Chris dropped wads of dried herbs into the metal bowl. Heavy acrid smoke billowed up, stinging our eyes. Ancient spirits, Chris said as we stared at him with rapt attention. Ancient spirits, hear us, we beseech you. Ancient spirits, hear our call. Ancient spirits, answer us. Ancient spirits, come to us. Ancient spirits, the way is open. Ancient spirits, take this offering and come to us. Chris ran a scalpel that none of us had seen, across the palm of his hand. Lisa recoiled in shock. The blood sizzled as it met the flames in the bowl. Jesus Christ, Chris, Sophia said. He shushed her with a glare. Ancient spirits, Chris called. Hear us. The way is open. Answer our... And then the doorbell chimed. Now we all jumped, including Chris. The doorbell chimed again, and through the door we heard muffled voices. Trick or treat? Sophia huffed and rolled her eyes. Well, the ancient spirits are here and they want candy. I thought you turned off the porch light. She stood up and walked to the door. She flipped on the porch light and opened it. 2 little kids were standing there, both dressed like witches, with pointy hats and green masks. They giggled, shoved their widespread pillowcase sacks towards Sophia, and yelled, "Trick or treat," at the top of their lungs. Sophia looked around for the candy dish, then saw it on the kitchen table. It was empty, save for some wrappers. Sorry, kids, we're all out. That's what it means when the porch light's off. The kids looked at each other for a moment. Can we come inside, ma'am? My sister really has to go to the bathroom. Sophia nodded and stood aside as 2 little pointy witch hats bobbed past. As the shorter of the pair went to the bathroom, the taller stood near the couch, next to Pete. She said nothing and was very still. I found myself sneaking glances at her mask. It seemed far too elaborate for a child's mask, and the black pits that hid her eyes seemed to drink in the light. There was a crash from the hallway leading to the bathroom. Chris and I jumped to our feet and ran to see what had happened. The smaller of the 2 children kneeling at the entrance to the hallway. I'm really sorry, I broke the mirror on the wall. My hat's too big and it must have caught the frame. I tripped. I can't see where I'm going. She tilted her head down and began to cry softly. Nah, don't worry about it, it's just a cheap old mirror, Chris said. He extended a hand, his cut hand. I thought to myself, without knowing why, and pulled her up. It's getting late. Your parents must be worried. Yeah, it's almost midnight. Sis, we should be going. We turned to see the sister leaning over Pete's sleeping form, green mask pressed close to his ear. Hey, what are you doing to Pete? Lisa said. She stood and walked toward the taller child. He was sleeping, the taller witch said, shrugging. Her rubbery, pointed green nose bobbled. I was telling him to have a sweet dream. The two children left, clutching their pillowcase sacks and jostling each other as they walked down the sidewalk. I watched them go, and as I saw them turn the corner, I think that I may have seen them both take turns licking at the smaller one's hand. We shut off the lights, bolted the front door, and relit a few of the candles that had gone out. Chris picked up his book again as we rejoined him inside the salt circle. Ancient spirits, hear us, he cried. Ancient spirits, we call you. Ancient spirits, hear our call. Answer us. The old grandfather clock began to toll, the first of 12. Chris sprinkled more sage into the redly glowing metal bowl. Ancient spirits, we beseech you. And then a candle went out. Sophia snorted and put her hand on mine. My heart slammed to a stop. Then I realized she was only trying to pull the Zippo I had been fidgeting with out of my hand. She winked, then reached over to light the candle. But another candle went out, and another. The room was plunged into a murky darkness, only lit from the flickers of the coals in the metal bowl. Okay, said Chris with only a slight tremor to his voice. The ancient spirits have heard our call and have responded. He shifted slightly and closed the box. On the top of the box was an ornate inlay of letters and numbers in the style of an Ouija board. Chris drew a small white planchette from his shirt pocket and beckoned us to place our hands upon it. We moved the planchette on the board in small, slow circles. Ancient spirits, are you here with us? Something crashed in the kitchen. I made as if to get up, and Chris motioned for me to stop. Don't leave the circle, he said. Stay inside the circle, never break it. Nothing can harm you if you don't cross the boundary. We placed our hands back on the planchette. Ancient spirits, are you here with us? Chris asked again. The planchette slowly moved to a corner. Yes. Boards creaked in the darkened room around us. This is too spooky, Chris, Sophia said. It feels like something's watching us. And then she looked down. In the twitching red glow of the flames, a shadow seemed to spread across Sophia's chest. She looked up at us and opened her mouth to speak. A flood of blackness flowed out of her mouth and down her chin. She slumped forward, knocking over the metal bowl. The burning coals scattered. Sophia! I lunged toward her. A smoldering coal burned my hand, but I didn't feel it. I could only think about Sophia's beautiful hair. It was on fire. Get the lights, Chris yelled, standing. He shoved me off Sophia out of the circle. I scrambled to my feet. I could see nothing in the inky blackness. Liz was screaming over and over. A wall should have been inches away, but I felt nothing. I reached out frantically, though. My fingertips caught on something. The sleeve of a shirt. It jerked away. There was a blinding, burning pain on my arm, and I fell flat and away, clutching the wound. Blood soaked through the sleeve of my shirt. I crouched low, trying to see something. Anything. I turned back to the circle. Liz's face, mouth, and O of surprise, jerked backwards. Her slashed throat sprayed blood across the room, and it smelled like copper. I turned to my right with my arm out, and I ran. My hand slammed into the doorway with force. A fingernail peeled back. I dropped to my knees, then crawled forward. My fingers met the cold steel of the refrigerator. I flung the door open. Light flooded the kitchen, and I huddled in the corner shaking. That's when I heard a racking scream from the other room. Chris. I snatched a heavy cast iron frying pan from the stove. Heavy pan raised up high above my head. I stood to the side of the doorway. Blood trickled into a pool in the elbow of my shirt, and I heard the slow slide of footsteps. There was a low whispering breath, and I was paralyzed with fear. What if it was Chris or Sophia? Light glinted off of a butcher's knife. I swung as hard as I could. My lips peeled back in a rictus grin. I grunted an involuntary ha. The edge of the cast iron pan caved in Pete's face as if it were a Sunday morning egg. He went down in an untidy heap, and I swung again, bashing his head until it was a lumpy mess, till his body stopped twitching. Still clutching the pan, I ran for the front door. It took me an hour to reach the front door. It could not have been farther than 15 feet away, but it felt like miles, and as I stumbled and crawled to the door, terrible things whispered to me, laughed at me, mocked me. I saw the dim shapes scuttle away as I looked, eyes straining to see my attackers. They darted in and gouged my flesh with claws and hot, grasping hands. I flailed blindly in the dark with the frying pan, but they only laughed. And when I did reach the door, it was locked. I smashed the antique stained glass with a blow. Then I climbed through it, lacerating my hands and arms more in the process. Now, the official police report states that Peter McCulty, 19-year-old Caucasian male, several priors including vandalism and possession, was under the influence of a large amount of controlled substances. There were traces of Adderall, Effexor, PCP, and other identified drugs. He experienced a psychotic break and killed several people. Now, initially, I was suspect number one. A police officer found me walking down the middle of the street, covered in blood and bleeding from dozens of cuts, fists clenched tightly around a cast iron pan. The police took a dim view of my story, and once it was determined that drugs had been involved, they ignored it completely. As far as the cops were concerned, a bunch of kids took some acid on Halloween. They played at a satanic ritual. Then one went off his rocker and killed a few of the others. It happens every Halloween. I was remanded into psychiatric custody for 2 weeks. It was only after I was released that I found out that the police had only recovered 3 bodies, not 4. You see, they never found Chris or any trace of him. Now, I've never gone back to that house. I think about going back every night. I take my meds that make me forget mostly, and I suppress the whispers that I hear in those long black hours before dawn. But sometimes I still hear them. Every year as Halloween approaches, the voices get louder, even if I up my dose. They tell me terrible things. They tell me it was my fault. They tell me I was the one with the knife. The Wanderer on the Tracks. On Halloween of 1988, 6 teenage boys ventured into a tunnel on a local railroad. Only one escaped with his life and a photo. What resulted from that innocent venture was a 2-year period of unexplained murders which killed off a good 10% of my small town's population. To this day, no one knows the true fate of the 5 boys and the reason behind the murders that lasted into the fall of 1990. Except for me. I'm the lone survivor of the 6 who encountered the Wanderer on the tracks on that dark Halloween of 1988. It was supposed to be a simple dare. Nothing to it. Everyone had heard of how, every Halloween, people head into the tunnel and never come out. We all thought it was bullshit. Then again, we were only 14 and not very well learned in the way of the paranormal. All we expected was just some crazy dude in a bedsheet. However, what we found was much worse, and what we did made the outcome 10 times worse than it could have been. I guess that curiosity killed the cat really fits when remembering this story. It was me. I'm Steve. John, Andy, George, Bill, and Fred. Explaining our choice of costume is irrelevant. However, let us note that we all brought flashlights, and Andy had brought a bucket to collect candy in. Foolish Andy. I remember your death so vividly it haunts my dreams to this very day. And she does too. But not for long. We all had dinner at John's house, as it was closest to the tunnel. After that, we played some Super Mario Bros. On his NES to pass time until it was dark. When it was, we all departed to complete the dare we so foolishly accepted. I carried a Polaroid to show everyone what was really in the tunnel. We left when it was considerably dark outside. Most of the dads were parading their 7-year-olds up and down the street getting candy before it got really dark. And there had recently been some kidnappings in the area, but we didn't expect to meet the suspect, so we thought we would be safe. With each step towards the tunnel, it seemed as if it got darker, and when we arrived there, it was pitch black, and it was pretty much only us and the older trick-or-treaters outside. We all stopped at the entrance of the tunnel for a moment, realizing that we may not make it out alive. After waiting one more moment, we hesitantly stepped inside, turning on all of our flashlights. Now you have to understand that no one really wanted to do this. We felt this more and more as we went deeper into the tunnel. It was weird though. Usually a tunnel ended around 500 feet, but it seemed that this one went on for miles. We went on for what I want to say was another 3,000 feet, and that's when we saw it. At the time, we had no idea what it was, and if I had a choice, I would wish that I never found out what it was and what it did. "What the hell is that?" Bill asked, half whispering to the rest of us. What we saw looked like a girl that had covered herself in dark paint or makeup and had on a plain old nightgown. She was holding what looked like a rod or a staff. Her back was facing us. "Beats me," Andy shrugged. "Hey!" He yelled at the thing before throwing the bucket at it. It clanged off the creature and rolled to the right of the track. And then suddenly, it made the most gruesome noise in the world as its head rotated 180 degrees to stare back at us. I hastily pulled out my Polaroid and shot a picture of it. I put away the camera and shook the developing picture before putting it inside my pocket. Now at this time, everyone was frozen in place looking at the creature, seemingly paralyzed. But soon, the creature lifted the rod, and it threw it at Andy. It was horrifying and amazing, seeing it throw what we knew was a spear with such dexterity, as well as doing it backwards. The spear struck Andy in the chest, dead center in the sternum. His ribcage collapsed and blood sprayed from the entry and the exit. His spine snapped, and he crumbled to the ground. The blood-splattered spear was stuck in the ground a good 40 feet behind us, and then it was only a moment before we actually thought to run. We didn't even try to save Andy. I turned my head and saw the creature ripping open his chest, tearing muscle and organs apart as our dying counterpart screamed in his deathly throes. It seemed like the creature wanted to separate flesh from bone, as that is exactly what it had done. Andy's flesh and innards were scattered around his skeleton in a pool of his blood, and it was coming for the rest of us now. Bill was the next one it caught, eviscerating him in the same manner as it did to Andy. Then she got George, and then Fred, and then it was just John and I left. The creature was so close we could feel its putrid breath on our necks. The both of us heard its demonic growls and screeches as we just barely escaped its furious grabs for our costumes. We kept on running even though the lactic acid had built up so much in our arms and legs, and our breath was ragged, and we were just so damn tired. Soon we saw the end of the tunnel, and somehow it was morning, which was so illogical, but John and I were both happy to see the light of day. Suddenly I heard a trip and a stumble. John had fallen to the ground. We were outside the tunnel, and he tripped. I didn't even need to turn my head to know he would be gored and gutted. I ran a safe distance away behind some trees near my house, and his screams echoed through the neighborhood and awoke several families, wandering outside to see what was happening. Everyone who went outside all saw the creature as it tore John apart. When it was done, it swept its eyes across the shocked citizens of my small town and let out a deafening roar that no man or animal could create. It then dashed back inside the tunnel, and everybody ran inside their homes, including me. Now, for 2 years after that, the people who saw the creature were found disemboweled and skinned in their homes. Some people tried to move, but I heard them say it was like they were chained there, that the creature was holding everyone here, keeping everyone who had seen it captive in this town. Now I'm the last surviving person who saw the Wanderer on the tracks, and my time is coming soon. So, how did I last so long? I don't know. I bet it's teasing me, torturing me, making me shit my pants every time I turn a corner. It's taken a hold of my life, and I can no longer function like other people. I can no longer go out into the dark. My windows are always closed, the blinds always down, the doors always locked. I've tried to kill myself multiple times, but I can't. It won't let me. Recently, I've been hearing the dying screams of my friends. I've heard a bucket clanging from outside my window, tapping on my front door at night. It's a sign. It's coming for me soon. Halloween 2020. It was Halloween night, 2020, and Mason Cummings' parents were nowhere to be seen. No, they weren't missing, nor were they dead or injured. In fact, they were perfectly healthy, at least for now. Mason's parents, Karen and Stuart, were wealthy enough to afford several vacations a year, and in the latter part of the year, they resolved to take several back-to-back to make up for the ones COVID lockdown mandates had stolen from them during the spring and summer. As a result, they left their mansion of a home in the care of their 20-year-old son until they returned on November 1st. "Make sure," Mason's mother told him as his father jammed their 10th stuffed suitcase into their newest car, "that you don't let any trash anywhere near the house." Mason smirked. His mom thought nearly everyone was trash, including him and Dad on some days. "Keep an eye out for anyone looking up to no good. You know, sagging their pants or wearing some cheap, ugly costume on Halloween. And not some gross trick-or-treater kid either. I don't want a speck of dirt on even the doormat between now and the time we get home. You got it?" "Got it," Mason said cheerfully, and Mom walked down the driveway in her heels, briefly raising a hand in farewell as Mr. Cummings laid down on the horn for her to hurry up so that they'd make their flight. Mrs. Cummings didn't need to worry about the doormat because it was nowhere to be found by 12 a.m. on Halloween night. Someone who'd left the party early had stolen it. The house was a hive of hedonistic anarchy, swarmed with half-dressed, half-conscious college kids and completely littered with trash. Early on, the festivities were loud enough to arouse the ire of everyone in the neighborhood. The partiers had already earned one warning from the police, and so, after a while, and as they were finally becoming tired, they calmed things down. Most of the guests had left. Now it was just Mason, Aaron, and Emily. Aaron was lovable oddball from Mason's group, always up to weird and dumb antics, but still outgoing and obnoxious enough to fit comfortably into Mason's clique. He'd come dressed in a dollar store Deadpool outfit that was 2 sizes too small. He was the only one who wore a costume, not because he missed any memo that it wasn't a costume party, but simply because he felt like it. Indeed, no one had worn any sort of mask at the party, scary or otherwise. Emily was Aaron's girlfriend, known for being short and fast-talking, and for flawlessly performing Ellie Woods in her high school's production of Legally Blonde. Not because of any acting talent, but because her personality was essentially the character. Look, I just don't believe in outer space, you guys. Like, how can it be a real thing? Like, we can't leave the mantle of the Earth. It just isn't possible. Am I wrong? I can't be wrong about this, you guys. Like, you don't even know how many times I've fought with my friends over this. It was an oddly friendly debate the 3 friends had had before. Aaron was laughing hysterically, still drunk. His hair was a mess. He'd finally taken off his Deadpool mask. Mason was just shaking his head, flashing a pearly smile. None of them gave a shit if outer space was real or not. Mason thought it was, but what did outer space matter to him? Outer space, real or not, hadn't crushed his party, and neither had anything else, including COVID, whose existence mattered even less to him than the existence of space or whatever was out there floating through it. Aaron slowly looked around the room, taking in the sight of the trashed house. In the kitchen, the glass of one of the microwaves was broken and blood-soaked from someone's hand. In front of them lay an overturned bookshelf. Every family portrait hanging on the wall in the hallway had been torn. The face of the clock hanging over the fireplace was cracked, and that was only downstairs. Dang, he chuckled. Your parents are going to be so pissed. Mason scoffed. Nah, they'll get over it, he said. They can replace all their shit. Nah, I don't know, man, Aaron said skeptically, still laughing. This is pretty bad. Like, yeah, Emily agreed, nodding rapidly and laughing to herself. This was probably the biggest party you've ever thrown. It's a big house, said Mason with a shrug. Not everything's broken, and they'll get over what is. It's not a big deal. This is a big house, Aaron said slowly, as if he were just now noticing it. He gazed around again, as if in awe. You know, I bet someone could still be passed out in one of the bathrooms, and we wouldn't find them until morning. He laughed uproariously, and his girlfriend pushed him playfully, again joining his laughter. Mason smiled. He rolled his eyes. Y'all are morons, he remarked affectionately. Emily and Aaron continued to laugh. It seemed they could go on all night. But then something interrupted them. The chime of the doorbell. Mason glanced up at the clock. When he remembered it was busted, he got annoyed and took out his phone. It's fucking 3 o'clock in the morning. Who the hell could that be? Trick-or-treaters? Aaron guessed sarcastically. Emily giggled and pushed him again. Shut the fuck up, Mason mumbled, although he did privately worry that some adult late-night trick-or-treaters had indeed turned up. The kind of trash his mom had warned him to look out for. After a moment of trepidation, he walked to the front door and creaked it open. He wasn't so sure who it'd be, guessing now that it might be the cops again. But it wasn't. It was indeed a trick-or-treater. A kid under a sheet with holes cut into it for his eyes. Maybe 6 or 7 years old. Whoa, Mason said, taken aback. He blinked several times, as if to make sure he was seeing correctly. Kid, he said. Where the hell are your parents? He stuck his head out the door, looking around to see if anyone was accompanying the trick-or-treater, but the street was totally empty. The kid didn't answer. He didn't say anything. Instead, he silently extended his arm and presented his pumpkin-shaped candy bucket. Only one piece of candy was inside. Mason looked down and squinted at it. It was large for a piece of candy and wasn't the brand that he recognized. It seemed to be dark red in color, and for one terrible moment, he thought he saw it moved and believed it might be a tarantula. He jumped a little. The kid rattled his candy bucket incessantly, as if imploring Mason to take whatever was inside. He briefly turned his head to look at his friends for help, but they only stared back at him and the kid, fascinated and a little scared. Hey, what's he got, man? Aaron asked. Don't know, Mason replied. He turned back to their visitor. What's that, kid? Some kind of Halloween decoration? The kid, still silent, leaned forward. His eyes grew large, and for the first time, Mason noticed how unusual they looked, bloodshot with seemingly bright and red irises and violet pupils. The dark circles under the kid's eyes seemed to suggest he hadn't slept in days. Maybe he'd been out all night, lost. The kid also apparently hadn't seen the sun in quite some time, judging by the strange paleness of his skin, just visible through the holes in the sheet. Mason looked at the kid for a moment more, before slowly reaching into the bucket and picking up the object, some sort of spiked ball. Whatever it was made of some strange, prickly material, as if he were holding a ball of static. Mason's instincts told him to drop whatever this strange orb was, but he clutched it, fascinated. He wasn't able to guess what it was. He'd never touched anything like it before. Its strange spikes, which Mason had initially taken to be spider legs, seemed to be pricking his palm, but it wasn't painful. They made a strange noise like the quick rustling of many needles. There was no mistaking it, though. The thing, indeed, was moving. Suddenly it gave a small but piercing screech, and Mason shouted in alarm and dropped it. And as soon as it hit the floor, he kicked it into the night. Kid, he spat. What the hell do you think you're... But when he looked up, the kid was gone. Mason blinked, stunned. He peered out the door, looking down the street both ways, but could see nothing but street lamps and houses in the still quiet of the night. Where'd he go? Aaron was laughing. Didn't give him his treat, so he gave you a trick. Shut up, Mason groaned. He began walking back to his seat in the living room, but stumbled. The chills of sickness had suddenly flown up through his body. Damn, he groaned, shivering as he eased back into his chair. He tried to say something, but was interrupted by a fit of coughing. Dude, you don't look so hot, Aaron said, genuinely concerned. Mason's coughing continued, now worsening into hacking. Some mucus flew onto the floor. His nose leaked a thin and runny snot. Oh, ew, Emily cried, jumping away. What the hell, Mason? But Mason couldn't respond. His head was swimming. It felt ready to crack in two. Dude, you're like white as a sheet. And he was. Mason began to sweat. His skin took on a ghostly pallor. He grabbed his chest, and suddenly breathing seemed hard. Still possible, but hard. Harder than it ever had been for him. But still he seemed finally able to talk. He said with some difficulty. He paused to cough. I might need to lie down. Oh my god, do you think it's COVID? Asked Emily. The kid kind of looks sick. Nah, he couldn't give it to him that quickly, Aaron pointed out. But he had to admit to himself It wasn't the stupidest thing Emily had ever said. Not by a long shot. Still, you might have it, bro. It could take a few days to come on. Mason nodded. His breathing was labored, but he wasn't yet worried. He was still able to get air. It wasn't too easy, but he was definitely able to get air in. That was good. Yeah, that was good. Dude, you need to go to the hospital or something? No, cried Mason, throwing more mucus on the floor. He coughed violently. No, no, guys, I hate hospital. Really, I'm fine, guys. Like, you don't look fine, Emily remarked. Her face suddenly turned worried. Her mind began to race. Maybe we should leave, she said, turning to her boyfriend. Leave? Mason said incredulously. What? Afraid I'm going to give you COVID? His friend said nothing for a moment. Well, dude, you probably have it, Aaron finally said with some trepidation. We might already have it too since we've been around you all night. We might have given it to everyone at the party. We should probably tell them. Yeah, Emily agreed, nodding. Yeah, and then there's that kid. You might have given it to him too. Yeah, Aaron said. And we don't know what that kid was doing out so late without his parents. We should call the cops or someone to find him. I mean, he could be out there lost. Mason shook his head and waved a disapproving hand as he tried hard to catch his breath. Kid didn't say he was lost, did he? Someone was probably with him. Like who? Emily asked. Like, who takes our kid out trick-or-treating at 3 a.m? Mason glared at her. Yeah, Aaron responded. If that kid was with someone, wasn't his parents. I don't know, maybe he got kidnapped. Maybe the kidnapper sent him to the door to give you that weird thing in his candy bucket. Yeah, Emily gasped, realizing something. Yeah, Mason, people do some fucked up shit. Like, someone might have been using that kid to poison you. You don't know what that thing was. Maybe it's not COVID. Maybe that kid put poison in you. Mason eyed her quizzically. She hadn't made this much sense in all the time he knew her. She looked terrified, though. Aaron, too, and he was just about to relent and allow them to take him to the hospital. But then, out of nowhere, a giant bone-chilling moan, like that from some tortured phantom, sounded loudly from upstairs. Emily let out a little yelp. Aaron paled, looking nearly as white as Mason, and everyone froze. Mason was too scared to even cough, though he did feel the urge to. What in the fuck was that? Aaron whispered. Mason thought for a moment. Suppressing a cough, he answered reasonably. Someone from the party? You said it yourself. We might have forgotten someone in one of the bathrooms upstairs. That didn't sound like someone drunk to me, Emily said fearfully. Mason covered his mouth to cough. Well, he said, almost annoyed. Well, it could be anything else. Emily had to summon all her strength not to cry. She turned to her boyfriend. Aaron, she said in a small voice. Maybe you should go check. Aaron gulped. He hesitated. Then, reluctantly, he nodded, and without a word slowly ascended the staircase at the far end of the room. Emily clasped her hands together, watching Aaron fearfully until he disappeared into the upstairs. Suddenly, Mason erupted with his worst fit of coughing yet. He stood, bending over and holding his stomach. Emily turned and was horrified to see Mason retch violently and vomit up what seemed like a bloody wad of tissue. She cried out in horror. Mason trembled, staring at what he could only register as some organ he'd coughed up. His lung, his stomach, something that no one should ever see, and only ever saw if they were certain to die. Some part of himself that he knew must have been there inside of him. But that didn't seem real until now when it was staring him in the face. plopped lamely on the once immaculate white carpet in a chunky pool of blood and mucus. Before anyone could say anything, the upstairs erupted with Aaron's screams. Suddenly, Emily and Mason were caught in what seemed like a terrible windstorm swirling throughout the entire house. More furniture crashed. The dressers upstairs, the kitchen cabinets. The lights flickered and buzzed. Emily was tearing her throat, screaming. The whole house seemed to quake, and from upstairs, Aaron's screams continued even louder amid the bedlam, though they were now desperate and muffled and choked. Something snaked its way from downstairs. Mason's eyes bulged as he looked up to see what was clearly a pure white bedsheet floating down the stairs without anyone in it. At least, not anyone human. He thought he could detect the eyes of the kid, those strange, sickly red-purple eyes suspended like sinister alien planets in the eye holes of that sheet. And then he heard the fast, scuttling, needly sound of the kid's strange, spiky ball, so loud it was overtaking Emily's screams. And it grew louder, and louder, and louder, devolving into a loud and terrible buzzing, sounding now like a swarm of angry killer bees. The sheet spread out wide when it finally came to the bottom of the stairs. Aaron's screams faded away, as did Emily's. The sheet seemed to be covering all, like a blanket, the eye holes fixed squarely on Mason, and it was gliding toward him slowly like a sinister and hungry stingray. Mason searched around. He could barely make anything out in the house. Everything seemed dark and blurry, and time seemed to slow to a crawl. The lights continued to flash, now at a slow and random intervals. Emily had vanished. The only thing he could see clearly now was the sheet expanding, somehow reaching every inch of the room. The front of it lifted up slightly as it came closer, and Mason could see underneath it that it was being propelled forward by those piercing, scuttling spikes that were now protruding out of the eye holes. Mason Cummings stood on weak legs, ready to collapse. His terror seemed to leave him. He seemed resigned to his fate. Through the days of his blistering fever, he accepted, finally, that he played with fire, and now he was going to pay for it. The sheet slowly rose up. The virus revealed itself, its round face seeming now to split open into a gaping mouth. The spikes seemed to become a set of sharp and terrible teeth, and the virus let out a loud, hungry screech, and then, in an instant, Mason was swallowed whole, and the sheet collapsed over all. The next day, Mr. and Mrs. Cummings arrived home to a suspiciously quiet house. Opening the door, they faced a nightmare beyond comprehension. Seeing first her son's pale, lifeless face out of everything, and his blood-stained mouth, Mrs. Cummings screamed until she fainted. Sole survivor. I dropped my mask, hold on, Jeremy said. He jogged back a few feet and picked up the same worn-out Batman mask he had been wearing on Halloween for the last 3 years. His cousin's tall, slender figure was disappearing into the crowd of Halloween revelers that had gathered on Germantown Ave. Elijah! Jeremy bumped into the back of his cousin, his glasses bouncing off the small of Elijah's back. Elijah grabbed Jeremy by the front of his hoodie. You must have stepped on my sneakers. You're gonna pay for those. Sorry, Elijah. Listen, I'm going to Chris's place. I'll pick you up in the corner 2 hours. 2? Well, I thought you weren't going to hang out with those guys anymore, Elijah. Mind your business. I don't have my phone. My mom took it. I know. So be here. Elijah turned and walked away. Jeremy walked up a few blocks until the crowd thinned out and spotted the only house with lights on. He walked up to it and saw that the door was ajar. He strained his neck but couldn't see into the house, but after moving up 2 steps, he was able to see just inside the door. A few candies wrapped in plastic were sprinkled there. "Hello?" His eyes caught onto a trail of more candy that led the way through the house to a padlocked door. Jeremy walked in, picking up the candy as he went. A light was glowing through a doorway on his left. He walked towards it and stopped when he saw an old man sleeping in a recliner chair in front of a muted television. Jeremy backed up slowly. He walked back to the front door, but when he flipped the deadbolt and pulled on the handle, the door wouldn't open. Come on. A hand closed over his shoulder and Jeremy screamed. "Shh!" A voice spat at him. He turned around to face a young woman. "Do you want to wake him up?" She shivered. Her blue eyes were open so wide that he felt like he could count the red veins that stretched around them. "Let me go," Jeremy said, looking at the door. "It's locked. There's another way through the basement, but you have to get the key from him," she said. "I have to go home." "The basement is the only way out. You have to get the key from his pocket while he's asleep." "Come on," she said, grabbing his hand. They stopped in the doorway and watched the sleeping man. "Is he your dad?" Jeremy whispered. "No." They stood there for a few seconds, the woman still holding his hand. He felt a shiver run through her again. "You have to get the keys." "I can't do it. I shake too much." "Well, can't we just break a window or something?" Jeremy said. "They're all boarded up and my sister's down there." "What?" "Yes, my sister trapped down there. We have to get her out. If you get the key ring, then we could go down to the basement and out the hatchway doors that open up into the garden." Jeremy couldn't think of an alternative. I'll try." The woman backed away into the shadowy hallway. Jeremy stood in front of the man. He gritted his teeth and reached his hand towards the key ring sticking out of his pants pocket. He pulled slowly until it was free, stopping only for a moment when the man snorted. Then he moved back down the hallway to the basement door. Jeremy looked up at the woman and she shivered powerfully again. In the moment before her final convulsion, he swore he could see a flash of blue light twist through her eyes. "Are you okay?" he asked. "Yes, I'm fine. Unlock it quickly." Jeremy unlocked the padlock. He pulled open the door and was slapped with a rank smell. He put his sweatshirt over his nose and mouth. "Who's there?" Choking voice said from the living room. Jeremy rushed down the steps and nearly bumped into the woman. "There's a flashlight there," she whispered. Jeremy scooped up the flashlight and turned it on. He swung it back and forth around the room, trying to take in everything at once. Finally, the light landed on a rusty metal. He moved the light down to a purple bloated face staring out at him from between the metal mesh of a human-sized cage. Jeremy screamed. "Who's down there?" the man screeched from above. The light of the flashlight produced more of the atrocity before him. A naked woman's body was slumped face first against the cage, her tongue lolling out of her mouth. Her eyes had popped mostly out of their sockets and rested on her cheeks. He looked behind him where the young woman had just been standing, but she was gone. He took a step closer and looked at the face of the dead body. It was the same woman. He trailed the beam down to her ankles and saw that the skin was blackened there. A live electrical wire from the wall was sticking through the bars. He had been electrocuting her, Jeremy thought. A gurgling noise made Jeremy jerk the flashlight to the right. Its beam wobbled over a second cage. It held another woman who looked beaten beyond measure, but still alive. She stared out at him. but could only cough and spit blood out of her mouth. The man's footsteps were descending the stairs. "I'll get help." Jeremy whipped the flashlight around the room, looking for the door. He started to panic, but then he looked at the ceiling and saw the hatch doors. He grabbed a chair from the corner and slammed it down under the doors. "Who is that?" the man shouted. Jeremy stood on the chair, wobbled, and pushed up as hard as he could. The doors flopped open, and he managed to grab the metal edge of the door frame and pull himself up. A hand grabbed at his ankle, but he kicked hard and pulled himself forward, digging his hands into the grass. He ran towards the glow of a streetlight. Just as he was turning the corner, something grabbed the hood of his sweatshirt and pulled him back. He screamed and fell backwards onto the pavement. The old man's gnarled face looked down at him. He was holding a baseball bat with nails hammered into the end of it. The man raised the bat up over his head and swung it down, and Jeremy closed his eyes. A gunshot fired. Jeremy opened his eyes and sat up cautiously. The old man was laying next to him with a hole in his head. He turned to see Elijah standing there, tucking his gun back into the waistband of his pants. "We gotta get out of here," Elijah said, helping Jeremy up. They ran down the street, through the crowd, and all the way home. The next day, Jeremy saw a news piece on the woman the police had found in a cage in the man's basement. Apparently, she had been the only survivor of a string of murders the man had committed. Jeremy and Elijah never spoke of the incident again. The Fun House. The dusk air was clogged with a sense of deep-fried food, the air clouded with the exclamations of hundreds of happy carnival goers as they sped through rides with reckless abandon. It was the perfect evening, the joyous atmosphere filling the hearts and minds of everyone there with enough fun to last until their next adventure. I couldn't help but smile my brightest, widest grin. It was a season of carnivals, fairs, and outdoor festivals. The sweet smell of cotton candy washed over the land like a flash flood. The bright emerald of my eyes swept over the masses, spying large, overstuffed animals bobbing through the crowd as children and adults alike totted their prizes through the fairgrounds. Everyone here, tonight, was a child at heart, including myself. Spying one of my favorite carnival treats, the funhouse, I giddily trotted over toward the old converted trailer in search of those infamous mirrors and cheap pranks. My friends had all gone in search of their favorite greasy fair delicacies, leaving me to my own devices. Now, while I dislike going on most of the rides by my lonesome, I could more than handle the various mysteries inside the funhouse. After all, they were mostly geared to scare children. Most of them I'd seen a million times, and at most provided me a chuckle or two. Once in a while something would jump out and startle me, but even then the prank was met with laughter. It was a fun house after all. I dug a few tickets from my pocket, taking inventory as I read the sign outside the old trailer. A young Hispanic man stood by the door, his smile only broken by a sip from his fresh ice-cold lemonade he held in his right hand. As people entered, he would smile and nod, placing their tickets in his pocket. It was 5 tickets to enter. I had exactly 7. It was a fine way to end my magical night at the fair. Passing the little light blue squares of paper off to the vendor, I merrily stepped up to the stairs and into the dark interior of the large refurbished trailer. I had to blink a few times to adjust my eyes to the light. Pausing for just a moment, I pulled the length of my long red hair back over my shoulders and secured it with the purple hair tie from my left wrist. I was ready to have some fun, all by my lonesome. And as I began down the tiny dark corridor, I could hear the echoes of the people who entered before me chuckling and squealing. I heard a couple up ahead, the woman giggling like a schoolgirl after her boyfriend, or male counterpart, I should say instead of making assumptions, let out a frightening cry, and I quietly uttered a chuckle at that. Men usually seem to be the biggest chickens when it comes to these type of thrills. As I rounded the first dark corner, I was met with my first scare. An old prop of a hanging man flew out from the way, its limbs flailing about limply from the sudden jolt that had forced it from its place in the wall. I jumped, my body flooded with an anxious tingling that seemed to dissipate out through my fingers and toes. I chuckled, pushing the dummy aside as I headed further into the funhouse. There was something odd as my fingers had pushed against the prop, though. It had felt slightly warm and gooey. Great effects. Perhaps they had actually put some effort into things this year. After another couple of feet, a ghastly glowing sheet came flying across the ceiling, accompanied by the familiar ghostly sounds Halloween had made famous. My green sights followed the sheet until it disappeared into the back wall. Without a second thought, I made my way further down the hall, and before long, I came to another corridor, my face almost meeting the black wall rather abruptly, if not for my toes hitting the painted cardboard. I blinked, squinting for a moment to gather my bearings again. It was easy to get lost in places like this. The black interior and lack of lighting leave you disoriented and easier to spook. Before I had time to recover from my encounter with the wall, there was a horrifying shriek, followed by another cheap prop dislodging from the wall. I let out a squeal of surprise, falling back onto the floor as the dummy swung back and forth in front of me. It had several flashing green LED lights scattered around it in odd places, and I chuckled as I plucked myself back up off the floor. I gave my butt a rub or two, my cheeks a little sore from the tumble. It was nothing big, especially not compared to the thrills I was getting this time around. I started off again, the dummy having the same warm, gooey texture as the last. This time, however, my fingers came away wet. I frowned a bit as I wiped them off on my jeans. Probably glue from those little dollar store LED lights. Perhaps the vendor could offer me some wet wipes afterwards. I mean, after all, it would only be right since it was their sloppiness that had caused it. There were several more props that dislodged from the dark walls, their little trap doors squeaking as they popped open to spit out some thrills. Various pain cries, shrieks, and Halloween sound effects echoed throughout the halls. I couldn't hear any more people in the trailer. They must have made it out already. But I was having a blast, my voice bouncing through the darkness with chuckles and squeals. I hadn't thought twice about the grotesque creativity used in the props, most of the dummies appearing rather lifelike in the dark. To me, they were simply an improvement to the same old funhouse spiel. It was nice to see and to feel some effort being made into this carnival classic. After about 5 minutes, I came to a door, my hand finding the knob before I even realized what was in front of me. I attempted to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. Frowning, I furrowed my brow in frustration. Removing my attention from the door, I felt my way around the hallway around me, running my fingers along the black walls. There didn't seem to be another way through. Maybe it was just jammed. I leaned my body into the door, my hands furled as tightly as they could around the little handle, and I noticed something strange when I pressed up against that door. There was a low mechanical hum coming from behind it. I paused, pressing my ear to the black entryway as I listened intently for any other sounds. Perhaps it was the generator outside that powered the entire funhouse. And so, shrugging it off, I lofted a little sigh of disappointment as I realized the door was not going to budge. I'd taken a wrong turn, obviously, and prepared to turn around and shuffle my way back to find the correct path. I slipped in something wet on the floor. Immediately, my stomach churned as my mind raced to assumptions. Someone had probably thrown up in here, either from fear or intoxication, and I just stepped in it. Now disgust rushed through me, quickly dispelling the happy vibe that had followed me around all evening. What a great way to end the night. Now focusing more on my surroundings, I began to notice a smell. Now it didn't reek of vomit, but rather it was a bitter and metallic smell. Perhaps it was oil from the generator. But it was a little different. It was more bittersweet. I scrunched my nose before heading back down the corridor. Whatever it was, it didn't matter. I had to be close to the end by now. I had a sudden desire to go find my friends and head back home for the night. My fun had been ruined by someone else's bad luck. At least I wasn't the only one who wandered down the wrong tunnel. Dragging my fingers along the walls, I searched for another passage, and it only took a moment or two before my fingers slid around a corner to my right. I don't know how I managed to miss it before, but I hurriedly turned the corner, and my face smacked right into another prop as I rounded it. I shrieked with the sudden shock, my body instinctively falling back away from whatever it was I had just run into. And as I glanced up towards the source of the thrill, several LED lights flickered on and off behind it, one of those cheap Halloween sound effects blaring in the background. What I saw in those few short-lived green flashes horrified me. This time I got a good look at the dummy, almost every last inch of its frame covered in what looked like blood. From the chest down into the stomach cavity was torn open. Fresh, sausage-looking guts poured out onto the floor. It hung suspended by its neck from the ceiling, and as I sat there on the floor, another bright green flash erupted from behind it. It was then that true terror struck me. Terrified eyes rolled down towards me, peering down directly into my own. That was no dummy. Completely encompassed by the sudden onset of fear, my body went into overdrive. As my limbs began to flail beneath me in an attempt to get up, I began to slip on blood that had pooled on the floor. My heart beat feverishly against the walls of my chest, and my breathing flying out of control as I began to drown in my own panic. All those dummies, those props, they were real. I began to whimper as it all began to sink in. Digging my heels down into the floor the best I could, I pushed myself back, crab walking back down the corridor in search of an exit. I was losing track of time, and so I crawled back frantically through the dark hallway for what seemed like forever, until it was safe to turn around. I wanted out of that freakish house of horrors immediately. That was no funhouse. I rolled onto all fours, and I became horribly aware of the racket I was making. How long had I been whimpering? Had someone heard me? Paralyzing fear threatened to break down the door to my subconscious as I crawled on all fours back the way I had come. I needed to get out of here, immediately. Whoever was killing people might still be in there, and I didn't want to meet them. At long last, I saw a brightening of the black heavy door cardboard walls of the funhouse. I gasped a sigh of relief, hot tears beginning to pour down my face as I hurried towards the exit. Sunlight became more apparent as I crawled, its weak last rays fighting for its life against the twilight. But there was a shuffling behind me, in the corridor, and there was a low scraping sound. I whimpered loudly, my voice jagged with pure horror. I was almost out of this place. At last I reached the door from which I had entered. Throwing my hands out into the door, I curled my fingers over the door jamb to thrust myself forward and on down the stairs. And as my body rolled out onto the grass, a loud cry of frustration echoed from inside the trailer. I didn't waste any time. rolling onto my stomach and pushing myself up onto my feet. And again my emerald eyes rolled along the crowd, their terrified faces gawking at me as I rose to my full height. I didn't wait. I didn't stop. Breaking out into tears, I pushed through the crowd, leaving bloody handprints on t-shirts and bare shoulders. I wanted to get out of there right now. When I finally found my friends, they all gathered around me in an effort to comfort my trembling frame, and by then I was uncontrollably crying, my salty tears leaving streaks in the bright red blood from the funhouse. Security had already been called, and it took them very little time to find me. They had stormed the funhouse, quickly discovering the grisly remains of 11 people. The culprit had yet to be found, but they were scouring the grounds as they questioned me. I only half listened. Crowds of hundreds of people and their oversized stuffed animals suddenly terrified me. One of them, any one of them, could have been the culprit.